judges and the courts are affected by two articles of the Constitution, Article 34 and Article 35. Okay, so now I'll start again on, I'm going to go over it. Yeah, okay. So the sixth articulation is no lawful establishment of the judicial organ of the Irish state. Okay, so again, here we go into investigation. The investigation is all these documents that I showed you there about the invalid Ministers and Secretaries Act. So that's all recited in here, okay? And then, so what happens is, with what I explained there before, this is recited here in the sixth articulation without me reading it all out because it'll take too long. It's obvious that prior to the plebiscite vote of the Irish people who approved enactment of the Constitution on the 1st of July 1937, the 7th and 8th Executive Councils had knowledge that the transitory provision of Article 58, Irish Constitution, for the purposes of continuing existing courts of justice with the same jurisdictions, was blatant deceit of the Irish electorate amounting to abuse of official power and criminality. So in a book I wrote, there's a huge amount of documentation that supports that clause, okay? And it all comes from the National Archives. They knew that things were invalid, they knew orders were invalid, and if you remember that kind of last letter that I read out from 1941, they knew that if somebody brought this up in courts that they would be in trouble. So that's what this clause is in here about, right? So it was blatant deceit of the Irish electorate amounting to abuse of official power and criminality. Quite simply, no valid lawful enforced courts have been established and no lawful enforced jurisdiction for judges existed. So Article 58.1 of the Constitution, again another transitory provision, says, on and after the coming into operation of this Constitution until otherwise determined by law, the Supreme Court of Justice, the High Court of Justice, the Circuit Court of Justice, and the District Court of Justice in existence immediately before the coming into operation of this Constitution shall, subject to the provisions of this Constitution relating to the determination of questions of the validity of the law, continue to exercise the same jurisdictions respectively as heretofore. That was an impossibility. They knew that the courts weren't properly established. They knew that there was a problem with varies with judges. They knew that the orders were, a lot of orders were missing and things weren't cataloged. So then what they did then is, with the Article 58 here, they were saying these courts will, their jurisdiction and the courts will pass into the new courts when they are to be made. So in 1961, they went about creating new courts using the Courts Establishment and Constitution Act 1961 to, in other words, create the architecture of the courts, Supreme Court, High Court. They created the Court of Criminal Appeal, which they knew was a fraud. I highlighted that previously. They knew that was a fraud. They even spoke about it during the debates. The question was put to Charles Hoy by, what's his name? McNeil, Deputy McNeil, that, you know, there was no provision in the Constitution to create a courts of criminal appeal. So why are you doing this? So Charlie Hoy, he said, oh, look, we'll just go with the nomenclature, that's it, and blah, blah. It was coming up to probably around this day. 1st or 2nd of August 1961, 3rd of August. Look, let's get this through and go on our holidays. You know, the dollars out. Yeah, okay, right. So on that day, they passed 2 acts. The one to create the architecture for the courts established in the Constitution, and then the one to create the jurisdiction for the judges, which was the Court Supplemental Provisions Act, 1961. But what they said in that was, the jurisdictions that were there in 1924 will pass in and become part of 1961. In other words, like, there was never anything wrong. Why do they do this? Because they know the people down the country, excuse me, won't understand this. They just created the people, consider the people a bunch of gobs.
Yeah.
Down the country bumpkins, that they wouldn't know what the hell was going on, right? Why? Because I wouldn't have known this if I didn't go through the files. They had all these files and kept all these executive council cabinet meetings. Everything was secret until they passed the National Archives Act, and then these things were put in there, right? So what's going on up there now, they're keeping secret, and we won't know it for another 30 years, right? What went on during the COVID and all of that, right? But this is a way now for the people, this declaration, to force their hand. As the people get into power, we go in and we get those files and make them account. There has to be Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right, in relation to giving people phony information about the vaccine. How many people died over this, right? Okay, so that's basically the 6th articulation. So consequently, the consequences of it are that justice can only be administered in Article 34, can only be administered in courts established by law. The courts aren't established by law, right? Judges don't have a power varies jurisdiction by law, okay? Not alone that, but Article 35 says the president can only appoint judges to courts established by law. What does that mean? Quite simply, all those appointments ain't worth a damn. There's no courts established by law. He doesn't have power. He didn't have power to appoint them. What it says here is the judges of this Article 35, subsection 1. The judges of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, the High Court, and all other courts established in pursuance of Article 34 hereof shall be appointed by the President. Right? How is this done? All judges shall be independent in the exercise of their judicial functions and subject only to this Constitution and the law. That's their oath. So here again, as I explained, nearly every article of the Constitution, things have to be done by law. Laws have to be right. Okay, that's the 6th. The 7th articulation is no lawful establishment of the legislative organ